Ener-Vate Webinar, Beyond LHEES, the Path to Heat Network Delivery and Learnings from UK Projects. I'm Tharina Conradie. I'm a senior consultant at Ener-Vate. I'll be the chair/facilitator today, and the webinar will be delivered jointly by Joe Longdon, our commercial director, John Maslen, our Scotland Networks business manager, and Pete Baynham, our head of consultancy. You will notice that the speaker and camera function has been disabled. We will therefore be sadly unable to address any verbal questions or any hands being raised. We do encourage and invite you to use the chat function if you have any questions, which we will aim to address at the end of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded for the benefit of those who are unable to attend, but it's also a great resource for you to refer back to if you may have missed a few points during the webinar. The slides will also be shared afterwards. The slides are a bit text heavy. There's reason to our madness. We wanted to provide a comprehensive resource for you to refer back to afterwards. And during the webinar, we'll pick out the key elements and the key points that we want to focus on during the webinar. We also aim to deliver the webinar within 45 to 50 minutes, allowing time at the end to address any questions you may have. Whichever questions we were unable to address at the end, we will follow up by email or incorporate as part of our sharing the slides. So we do hope you enjoy the time with us this morning, and I think we're ready to start, and I'm going to hand over to Joe Longdon to kick us off.
Thanks, Tharina. Thank you for that introduction. So my name is Joe Longdon. I'm the Commercial Director for Ener-Vate Consultancy. For those that don't know me or don't know Ener-Vate, Ener-Vate are a commercial consultants. We've been working on heat networks now for a number of years. Ener-Vate's 10 years old, but prior to that, working on heat networks as part of the E.ON team back in the day. So the sort of services we provide to our clients is everything at the beginning, if you like, the commercialization stage, from heat network identification, for feasibility assessments, market engagement, stakeholder engagement with both local authority and others, and then producing the commercial model, looking at how much will it cost, how much will it return, and then from there helping clients structure how they might want to deliver this, and we'll come on to that in a little bit more today. We also follow the project through, and so we stay in the project as long as the client requires us to, and in some cases that means that we actually help procure the delivery partner, and then we manage that partner on behalf of the council to ensure the contracts and the requirements that were set out to achieve are being delivered in line with the requirements of either the council or the private entity. And as it says there, we've got a John Maslen, who's now based in Scotland and working out of a Glasgow office. We've also got offices all over the UK. Next slide, please. So this slide really is just to demonstrate a few. We've got around 35, 36 live projects in terms of live networks at the moment, and many, many more customers. We get a lot of the repeat work from customers. So some of the names you'll see on here have more than one scheme. We work both with local authorities, government, we work with private developers, we work with some energy from waste providers and others that are looking to have who have obligations to provide heat and low carbon targets. So this really is just to give you a bit of a flavour for some of those names, but if you go to the website you'll see much more around the case studies and some of the testimonials of some of our customers. So what we're going to do is going to talk through a few projects, and we've just picked a couple at the very beginning of this to give you an idea of some of the differences between the projects. But then also, as we go through the slides, we'll refer back and we'll make reference to some of these schemes and some of the challenges and lessons learned along the way. I'm going to make an apology. I've got a bit of a sore throat, so if I keep coughing, apology now. So Merseyheat. Merseyheat is a Peel project. So Peel are a landowner in the northwest. They have significant landholdings and bring forward a number of developments. This particular one is Liverpool Waters, which is a huge regeneration project. It's a mixed-use waterfront development and it's on historic docklands. And we'll talk about challenges, and there's your first one, historic docklands. A lot of history, a lot of things buried in historic docklands. This project, phase one, is we're split into a few different phases. Phase one is operational. So phase one is some of the main spine of the network. We're providing heat to some residential customers already. Well, the main energy centre is part of phase two, and that's under construction right now. If you go over to the Mersey Heat website, you'll see there's a number of articles around the construction starting and what that might mean for the overall project. This project's actually a water source heat pump project. So there's the low carbon technology, and that's being installed later on this year into the main energy centre. And then we're currently in phase three planning now, which is the growth for expansion outside of the original scheme. So what that's looking at is in line with some of the zoning regulations and the plans is to take the network further out into the city centre. As mentioned, this is the Peel Group project, so it's a private entity, which is a challenge in itself sometimes, because a lot of the private entities that aren't always got the support externally with the councils, but luckily for us, the council are very supportive of this project. Our role here is everything from initial commercialisation. We've managed to secure funding on behalf of the client, both HNIP and Green Heat Network Fund. We went to market alongside the client and appointed a DBOM contractor, which in this case is Vital Energy. And we have an ongoing relationship with Peel and Mersey Heat to deliver the contracts with the customers and the management of the contract with the delivery partners. Next slide, please. So this scheme, LHEES Pipes, quite the opposite. This is a council scheme. This is Leeds City Council scheme. They didn't involve us initially to deliver the scheme. We did some modelling on their behalf, but we didn't do the initial feasibility for this one. The council were very ambitious, and they had some senior champions within the council that drove this project forward. And that's testament now to this scheme today, because it's an award-winning scheme. It's won many awards. They had a plan for a recycling and energy recovery plan quite close to the city centre. And what that meant was there was a low carbon heat source. So Leeds Council jumped on that and used that as a way to get heat in a heat network into the city centre. They managed to put some of their own money in and as it mentions there, secure additional funding from the Combined Authority and many other sources. This scheme is fantastic in the fact that it's already addressed some of their fuel poverty issues. They've taken 2,000 of their council-owned stock, which were apartments, off an all-electric scheme, and they're now connected to the low-carbon heat network. They've connected a number of their own public buildings to the heat network, and that again, many challenges. These old buildings require higher temperatures than what a lot of heat networks provide. There's some changes required quite often on some of these big old buildings. They're not necessarily plugged straight in, but they've been through a lot of learnings, and we've been through those learnings with them around some of the challenges of connecting retrofit buildings. However, it's done it, it's working. There's a large amount now of heat being delivered to those buildings. What they've also done is look at, okay, who else might need the heat? This isn't just a council scheme for council properties. So this now has new build developers connecting to the scheme. It has existing other buildings that are not publicly owned connecting to the scheme. And as I said, this is an award-winning scheme. It's low carbon and it's low cost heat. So it's making significant savings for a number of buildings across Leeds. And as all of the schemes, it's an expansion phase, and we're currently looking at where else we might take the network and where else the customers might wish us to take main spines to pick up other buildings. This is similar in the fact that it's a local authority scheme. This is a Manchester Heat Network. For those that you may know Manchester, there's a large tower of light. That's the energy centre. It's got a lot of press, and it's quite impressive for anybody who wants to have a look. This is a gas CHP scheme, and you might wonder why would a council put gas CHP, but that was the technology of choice. Many schemes across the UK are on gas CHP now and are looking to ways they can decarbonise. So that's exactly the position we're in here. There's a large investment made by the council. Again, initially using their own buildings as anchor loads. So every network needs some anchor loads to be able to get away, and using their own buildings is a prime example of how that works best. This phase one was completed in 2020, and it's got around 2 kilometres of pipework installed. And as I say now, we've been brought in by the council to help them look at how are they going to decarbonise, how can they grow the network, which are the customers, what's going to make it attractive, where the route should go, how much would it cost, who's going to fund it, all of the things that a lot of people on this call will be questioning today. So our role with the council in this scenario is to look at all of those options. And again, there's lessons learned around technology or choices, around pipe sizing initially, because a lot of the networks that have been installed in the UK didn't have zoning in sight, didn't have the foresight to massively oversize pipe work for future expansion. So some of that has to be unpicked as we go through the next coming years. The final project I'm going to talk to you about is LHEES. So one a bit closer to home. This is in West Glasgow. This is also a peel scheme, so it's a private-led scheme. It's initially designed around it was called a York Hill Quay area, which was the development area, now known as Glasgow Waters. This project is around 1,000 residential units with some commercial buildings on there as well. So that was our initial thoughts. Peel say, we've got this development, we want it to be low carbon, which way should we go? So we look at district heating, and we've been working on this one for around 2 to 3 years. And we've been through the master planning stage, we're feasibility, we've got a commercial model, we've got a business case signed off, we've got funding, we managed to secure some funding under the LCITP funding pot from Scottish Government, which will assist towards the construction costs. This again is Dockland area, and also water source heat pump is the choice of technology, as we are literally right on the water source. Again, it doesn't come without challenges. We've got monitoring equipment in there, we've got site investigation work undergoing, and we don't know until we actually start construction exactly what we're going to find. And this has come out in Liverpool, and we'll come on to some of those challenges and contingency points later. But again, it just shows that even in some of these hard areas, these regen areas, you can deliver heat networks. In city centres, you can deliver heat networks, but they're not without challenge, which we'll come into. But this particular one has taken a couple of years to get to this stage, and we're hoping that construction will start later on this year once planning is approved. Next slide, please. So why are we all here? Well, we're all here because there's been a natural development of heat networks over the last 18 years that I've been in the industry. More and more heat networks now because of the carbon emission standards and regulations that's come out. But right now where we are because of these the LHEES in Scotland. There's the Heat Network Act that obviously was passed in 2021 in Scotland. And then in England and under the UK, we've got the Energy Bill, which is recently being passed in October. So we've now all got primary legislation, and we're working through the secondary legislation, and you'll see there's quite a few consultations coming out. And I urge everybody, if possible, to review the consultation and feedback on the consultations, because that's the only way that government are going to understand the real market view. But what it does mean is that heat network zoning is coming, and heat network zoning is there to stimulate investment. There's a lot of investment coming to the UK, and give some assurances to those investors that their heat customers will be there. And not only that, it will deliver fuel poverty. It would help with fuel poverty because you're delivering low carbon heat. Will help with the decarbonisation. So decarbonisation figures, which other way are we going to get there if we don't start putting some low carbon technologies in now? And it will do it at scale and hopefully in a timely manner. So as I mentioned, there's quite a few consultations out with deadlines of February and March. It'd be really good if everybody could take time to review them, and we'll send the links out at the end. So a lot of you will have been working through your initial LHEES and your zoning and looking at clusters of heat and where they may be. Also looking at where your heat generation points may be. You might be close by to an energy from waste plant. You may be looking at, am I on the river? Can I do a water source heat pump similar to some of the projects we've decided today? But there's a lot of gathering of information right now and clustering of information, and that will therefore give the indicative zones that you'll be looking to put out. Now, as you can see, the first picture on that slide is the Glasgow LHEES, and there's a large amount of clusters of heat and zones identified. And the bottom one is 5, which is a little bit more spread out, but also clusters of heat identified. What we're hoping to do for the next few slides, and I'm going to hand over to John in a few moments, is just give some options for how you might want to consider your delivery methods going forward, the sizing of your zones, the number of zones, how you then procure delivery partners for your zones, and hopefully as we get to the end of these slides, you'll have a better insight into how that might happen. One of the things that is being discussed as part of the secondary legislation is the consideration of incumbent heat network operators. So where there is existing heat network operators, what rights do they get? How should you engage with them? What opportunities can that bring? Can that actually springboard a zone for you because you might have a heat network that's already either in planning or in construction that could be expanded out to some of your identified heat loads? So once we've worked through all this, the stakeholder engagement around the heat network zones is key, because the more people you can get on board, the quicker and easier these projects will be to deliver. I'm going to hand over to John now, who will go into a little bit more detail around some of the strategy and delivery planning. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Joe. Good morning, all. And it's great to see so many of you on the call today, particularly representatives from local government around Scotland, which is fantastic. Sorry for bothering you over the last few days to try and fill in some gaps, but no, it's great. Many of you are obviously finalising your LHEES and delivery plans, yet I would actually argue that most of your delivery plans actually need more time to finalise. And for many, the primary question remains, what is the optimal delivery route for progressing low carbon heat networks? And in effect, who should take the role of the programme sponsor? And also, which delivery model should be adopted? Right now, to date, both in Scotland and across the rest of the UK, there's a wide mix of different approaches that have been taken, but no real de facto approach has really emerged. So how do we address these questions? The approach that we would recommend is that local authorities consider an options appraisal of available delivery models. And that may or may not include governance options. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I've picked out Fife's LHEES, which does go into some level of detail about the sort of structure of governance that they imagine implementing for their LHEES. So that's a great example. But I think some others may need to look at their governance in a bit more detail, and I think this options appraisal should also look at governance as well as delivery models in those cases. How should they go about doing this? Well, we would recommend there is a series of workshops, structured workshops. These should involve officers, senior management, local politicians, and potentially those partners and external stakeholders that you want to involve in the process. They're going to involve a lot of awareness raising at the start, particularly to get everybody up to speed and at the same level, and then go through a sort of optioneering process whereby we ask lots of questions, and we would ask lots of questions and then score the answers against a relatively standard set of criteria. I'm going to talk more about that, those questions in the next slide, but in parallel to that, obviously we would suggest that you talk to other councils, particularly those around you, your neighbours, and those that are a bit further down the road. And some of the things that we're doing, for example, are arranging trips down to Leeds and potentially other clients. We've definitely got interest from people going down to Leeds. So if that's the sort of thing you'd be interested in doing, please get in touch with us and we can try and arrange something. But also, and perhaps slightly controversially in parallel, and reading the Glasgow LHEES over the last day or so, I'm really pleased to see this is picked up in theirs. If you as a local authority see heat networks as an opportunity in some form, then you really need some definition around the scale and value that opportunity offers you. And so without a vision, and I would suggest a 10-year vision would be a good place to start, I don't see how you can actually scale and value your opportunity. So I really feel that there needs to be a visioning exercise that you need to go through. And as part of that visioning exercise, you need to clarify the scale of the commercial opportunity that presents itself. So you'll need to do some form of techno-economic feasibility studies, particularly for priority zones that you want to take forward. And that may involve both individual zones and also grouping the zones together as a portfolio to assess their values. Now, this has very close parallels with, in fact, some work we did a few years back for Glasgow called Heat Vision 2030. And in fact, we tried to develop a method, some standard parameters, and some software tools or use of third-party software tools for developing these high-level business cases. And it's that approach, I think, would be really good to try and standardize and be able to roll out across all local authorities. So, returning to our options appraisal workshops, what are the sort of questions these workshops should offer, should ask? On to our next slide, please. There are lots of questions, and we won't have time to go through all of these in the workshop today. So I'm just going to pick out a few. As a local authority, this is a key one. Do you want to be a regulated local heat supplier? Effectively, a localized utility. What are your key objectives, and how do you prioritize them? Is it conformance to the legislation? Is it to address fuel poverty? Is it to address air quality? Is it to decarbonize your buildings and meet climate targets? There are lots of different drivers here, and prioritizing those drivers is really key. What, as another critical one, what is your appetite for risk versus reward? How much control do you want? Will you have the support of your political representatives, your citizens, and your business community in your plan going forward? And of course, what is actually feasible? And what you actually want may be two different things. So this is a balancing act, and it really requires some in-depth market knowledge to help you go through this process. The next two slides pick up on two of these key areas. One is around legal structures, and the next is around who you should be involving as stakeholders. So next slide, please. Many of you will have seen this table. It's a sort of high-level summary of delivery models. There are 5 of them that are pretty much open to most of you in taking forward your zones. We've ranked them here effectively from sort of heavier private sector involvement at the top, which is also for the council, lower risk, lower reward, and lower control, to option 5, which is much greater public involvement, but with higher risk, but also higher reward and higher control. Now, responses to the workshop sessions I've just talked about should steer you towards your preferred option. If we start at the top, option 1, I won't go through all of them in detail, but this is effectively where a project sponsor, a local authority, would appoint a third-party developer, often a commercial developer, who would then take that zone and through using a commercial ESCO. But right now, the number of examples of this model are very few. We had a session the other day. We couldn't actually think of any. Maybe you can. We'd be interested to hear if there are examples out there of that model. Option 2, perhaps a little more risky, but is the concession model. This is being turned into reality for Edinburgh Granton waterfront project. And that's often where a concession agreement gives a third party, usually a commercial developer, rights to develop and operate a heat network for a time limited period. I think the Granton one is a 40-year concession. Option 3, again, has got a lot of interest from the Scottish Government workshop in Glasgow that I went to before Christmas, which is around joint ventures. The classic example being Midlothian and Vattenfall creating effectively a JV called Midlothian Energy. Now the interesting thing about this is it's a general energy joint venture. It's not just a heat joint venture, and it's a partnership. It's very much a partnership. It's not just around heat networks, but on general energy projects. But certainly a number of LHEES that I've read have pulled out that as a model that they're very interested in exploring. Option 4 and option 5, increasingly we are moving to the public, the local authority taking more ownership, more control. So Aberdeen Heat and Power is an example of a wholly owned ESCO, whereas West Dunbartonshire Council's Queen's Quay project is an example where they have taken the project in-house and they're developing the network in-house. There are other models, some more common than others. I've given you a LHEES example at the bottom of the page, which is a not-for-profit community trust that runs the LHEES heat network. There are also more complexities in the 5 models that you see there. You can have different elements of the heat network with different models applied to them. You can flip options between one model and another model over time, or you can take a more hybrid approach where you might appoint a JV partner, but then use concessions for taking forward some zones. So it is more complicated than that. And it probably is wise to adopt a consistent model across your local authority. Now, the current DESNZ zoning consultation actually proposes to narrow those options down to maybe 2 or 3, even 2 options to try and simplify the range of options that are available to local authorities. Whether that's a good idea, whether that happens in Scotland, is up for grabs right now. Now let's move on to who to involve. So there are a wide range of stakeholders, and this landscape is evolving rapidly. It's relatively complex, given the interests and responsibilities of many parties, and there are a large number of roles that need to be filled. So you really need to decide which parties are critical core partners in your projects or your program, and which are consultative partners. And of course, effective engagement with all these stakeholders from a relatively early stage, from this sort of design and planning stage, is really key. And ineffective engagement is likely to be a significant risk to your project. I won't go through this slide in any more detail, but do refer back to it. Next slide, please. If we consider all the stages involved in delivering a heat network, this is the classic diagram lifted from a Bayes report in 2016, but things haven't really changed. We've focused up to now on activities in the left-hand box, the strategy and delivery planning box. But if we start moving forward into how we actually develop projects, once we've got an agreed delivery plan, they can progress effectively from the left-hand side through to the right-hand side. This splits the heat network project journey into 4 stages: the development stage, the commercialization stage, the delivery stage, and the operation, optimization, and growth stage as the final one. The Scottish Government have set up the Heat Network Support Unit, and typically this provides support to local authorities up to outline business case, and then potentially through to full business case at the end of the commercialization stage. Each of the 4 stages that I've outlined there can be further subdivided as they are towards the bottom of the diagram. I'm now going to pass over to my colleague Peter Baynham to take you through each of these stages from master planning through to operation, so he can highlight some of the lessons learned that we've had through our experience with projects. Pete.
Yes, thanks, John. So in the next few slides, I'll be walking through the development process, and as John said, just picking out a few of the key messages. Experience where we're actually driving the delivery ourselves, or we're working with others to deliver their schemes. In terms of the context of what the lessons learned that we're sharing, that's very much from the heat network developer viewpoint. Now, John highlighted various models that can be utilised by local authorities. So hopefully these messages, particularly if you're looking at a JV or local authority led scheme, hopefully many of these messages and learnings will resonate. But even if you're looking at the concession approach or a third party pure private ESCO approach, hopefully you'll find that there's value in what we're sharing in terms of understanding the process for your potential partner, and also understanding the value you have even at those early stages. So when we're looking at the project specific energy master planning, this is the next phase following your LHEES. And the thing to stress here is your LHEES is not wasted. This is around taking that information, and really it's about understanding what is real within there. And what I mean with that is to start to develop the data validation and further develop the understanding of the viability of the network. What I would say, and an example that we have of that, is to look at, does the type of supply available that you've already identified actually match the type of demand that is required? And one example of that we've got is we were working with a local authority where they had a scheme that had identified a great waste heat source. It was at 14-15 megawatts worth of supply. They looked at the available off-takers, and it looked at face value to be a great scheme. However, when they started looking at the temperatures that were available from that scheme, they found 60 degrees was the available temperature, which is perfect for their new build, a very significant new build area. But their anchor load as an NHS facility, and as we've mentioned before, retrofit tends to be at a higher temperature, needed 80 degrees. Now, what that meant was they needed to look again at the commercial model. How were they going to technically meet that requirement? That sort of insight needs to be established early, and the earlier you can establish that insight, the more real you make the scheme. And actually, this is about understanding the realistic value for the local authority, and start to formulate for yourselves how you're actually going to leverage that value when you're moving forward with your contracts, irrespective of whether it's a concession contract or whether it's value that's going to be held in-house by the local authority. Move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the next stage, this is about advancing the commercial and technical models, and also about advancing the data maturity. So what we typically find at this stage is that local authorities and developers tend to look at this purely from a technical perspective. They're looking at what are the options and tend to forget a little bit about the commercial perspective. That's the technical drivers need to be understood. The technical options need to be understood. The routing of the network and the size of the network, all of those things absolutely need to be understood. However, for us, the key aim of this is to understand whether or not the scheme will be investable. Is anyone going to be interested in this scheme? And again, just going back quickly to the example, the previous example I mentioned, if you look at that purely from a technical perspective, okay, we need to bring the temperature up from 60 degrees to 80 degrees. The technical partner's looking at it from that perspective and came up with 6 options. We worked with them, and actually only one of those options was commercially viable. So this is an example of where the technical and the commercial teams need to be working hand in glove. It can't just be technically led. It needs to be a technical economic model, a true technical economic model. This is also where we need to start thinking about the development of the detail of the risk and mitigation plans. A key thing here to remember, even at this stage, is that most people are thinking about the construction. They're thinking about how are we going to deliver this. And actually, that construction could be, for small networks, could be 12 to 18 months. For larger networks, that could be over the course of a number of years. But even if it's 10 years to build out, you need to have at the back of your mind, this is 40 years of operation. So when you're thinking about risks, it can't just be around how am I going to deliver this scheme. It's got to be about how am I going to operate this scheme, how am I going to deliver the right value for customers, and in that operation and in that delivery, how am I going to meet my strategic objectives, as John mentioned, whether those strategic objectives are addressing fuel poverty, decarbonisation, or indeed whether or not that's a commercial driver. I think if we just move on to the next slide, please. Now, as local authorities, most of you hopefully will be familiar with the outline business case and the 5 cases that underpin that. What we would say at this stage is very much prioritise your strategic and your management cases. So what I mean by that is revisit the drivers that you've established, revisit your strategic aims, your critical success factors, and understand, given the commercial case, whether or not you are still able to deliver against those. The commercial case is the means by which you can unlock the value and actually leverage whatever contract you are looking to take, or the means by which you're looking to take the scheme forward. So if you don't understand the value of the assets, that could be your portfolio of buildings, it could be the profile of the buildings that you've already identified that are going to be required to connect, the potential for the thermal supply agreements on how much that's going to cost. How are you going to leverage the procurement in the next stage? Even if you're going to be a third-party ESCO, you need to understand what is the value of your scheme. If you don't understand the value of your scheme, how can you then negotiate with a third party? So if the third party comes back and says, well, we can't actually afford the things that you want within the contract that are going to address fuel poverty, you have the ammunition, you have the information, you have the data that allows you to have a realistic conversation and actually have a realistic challenge to that assertion that what you're looking for, your strategic aims, are unaffordable, and therefore we're not going to be bidding for the scheme, or we're not going to take the scheme forward. If you don't understand the value, you cannot negotiate. Next slide, please. So again, just in terms of the key messages here, and the absolute key message for me on this one is do not underestimate the time required to deliver this phase. So going back to John's picture taken from Bayes, it actually says 12 months for delivery of this phase. Realistically, you have to think about what needs to be delivered. Now, whilst legislation is coming that allows a requirement to connect, or a requirement to connect both for the off-taker and for generators, that should be used as a last resort, and therefore there will be negotiation. And if you think about what you've actually got to negotiate in this phase, you're thinking about the thermal purchase agreements with one or multiple providers of heating to the network. You're looking at your anchor customers. You're looking at the DBOM. You're looking at whether or variations on DBOM. It may be an unwrapped contract. It isn't necessarily going to be a complete turnkey solution. You've also got to be thinking about way leaves, easements, planning, and where possible, the means by which you can shortcut some of those timescales. So making use of standard forms of contract to lessen the burden. And one of the other key learnings is to be really, really clear within those contracts and going through that procurement process on the risk share and the controls that you're going to put in place when those risks actually materialise. Again, timing of securing the off-takers and commencing the construction and the connection of the energy supply, all these things are key to understand, and the risks associated with those. So again, going back to a couple of examples where there were anchor customers who were so pivotal to the scheme that a 6 month delay would have an effect of knocking 3% off the IRR on the return for the scheme. So understanding how you're going to manage those are key. Looking at what is actually going to trip you up. Again, a 6-month delay may be as a result of other things happening in the area. So even here, you need to be understanding what else is happening in the wider context. So for example, if you're working on a development and there's a new build opposite you, they may well be closing the pavement for 6 months to put their infrastructure in for the development. That means you can't necessarily close the pavement on the other side of the road. If you were planning to put your district heating pipes in there, that's creating a real issue. So it's being aware of the things which may come back and sort of bite you, and understanding how you're going to control and manage those risks through the contract. And again, regular checks back to the base model and ensuring those changes are made so you understand the impact of those delays as well as the impact on your mitigation plans. Next slide, please. So it probably won't come as a surprise that the main takeaway here within delivery, within construction commissioning, is there will always be surprises. We call them variations, but there will always be surprises. You may well have done done some ground monitoring, dug a trench to look at infrastructure in the ground, but you can bet that 2 meters down the road from that trench is actually where you're going to find the asbestos or the ground contamination. Or in some cases, again, learning from experience, unexploded ordnance. So there is always something that will come and bite you. So the key to that is to understand the contract in detail. And alongside that, have a robust change management process. And as I said at the previous phase, is understand the risk share. Now, ideally, what that would mean is to have a contract management function that understands in great detail what happens if, so that you understand where the liabilities lie, and also taking that back and again revisiting all the time the impact on the commercial contract, because the decisions you make now are going to last and potentially have an implication for 40, 60 or even 80 years because of the lifetime of the networks. So it all comes back to that commercial model and understanding the risk impact on the whole life cycle of the project. Move on to the next slide, please. Again, as I've said, the operation and maintenance phase, often this gets sort of forgotten. As I say, people are concentrating on these early phases. That's the nearest crocodile. How are we going to get infrastructure deployed? How are we going to fund it? How are we going to structure it? How do we get things in the ground? However, this is the part that lasts for 40 years. So 3 key things to take away here. 1, what is the handshake between the construction teams and the operation teams? That's both on site and contractually. And 2, who ensures that the O&M provider is actually delivering against the KPIs? Again, we have experienced this within large private organisations and local authorities. Often the team that deals with the capital deployment is different to the team that deals with the O&M. And those upfront contracts may not have been communicated to the O&M team. So again, it's about understanding, is the O&M provider delivering against their KPIs under the contract? Who's actually going to own that? And not just the KPIs under the contract, the wider context of the contract. If you have put things in there around how you are going to meet your fuel poverty targets, for example, is the contract delivering against your strategic objectives? So who is actually monitoring that from a due diligence perspective? And then finally, keep the model up to date. The third point, I've said it all the way through because it is the key driver throughout. There are still opportunities within the operation phase to optimize that model. So when we talk about optimization in O&M, most people go immediately to the technical solution. However, by revisiting the commercial model regularly, you will pick up opportunities. And one example here is where we're working with a local authority. There've been a lot of changes within that local authority from a responsibility perspective, and people had lost sight of the commercial model and what was actually supposed to be achieved by that point. Now, we became involved initially to help grow the network. It became self-evident that the proposition wasn't viable. We helped the local authority to revisit their model to understand what the market is looking for, rebaseline the model, reforecast the cash flow. And also, just by doing that, we identified several hundred thousands of pounds were being spent unnecessarily on carbon taxation. That wasn't a technical solution, that was a commercial solution, and that was driven out of the regular review of the model and rebaselining the model. So I think that's it for the sort of key learnings through those phases that we wanted to draw out today. So I'm going to hand back to Joe just to wrap up and summarise those key points.
Thanks a lot there, Pete. So that is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Like I say, there's quite a lot of text. We've tried to keep it as short as we can for the 45 minutes. But what we want to take you to take away from today is some of the key learnings that we think as local authorities you'll need to understand. These projects, they're technically commercially challenging. There's no getting away from that. They're large infrastructure projects in city centres, in busy areas, etc. They do take time. They take a lot of planning. They take a lot of stakeholder engagement, but they're exciting. They are delivering everything that we've wanted to deliver for many, many years. It's just a case of getting it right. And getting it right now, as Pete says, you're setting yourself for 60, 80 years down the line. There's not a one size fits all in terms of delivery. A lot will come down to your own requirements, your own ambition, the risk reward slide that we've shown, the level of control you want. Some local authorities will have a partnership with an energy services company. Some will have an energy partner that deliver much more than a district heat network. Some will want to do it themselves and take the higher reward, but as you say, a lot more involvement. There's lots of options. There's people on this call who can help you with that. Ener-Vate's one advisor, we're commercial advisors, there's technical advisors. There's a lot of lessons learned across the industry over the last 15, 20 years. Use experience. Use people that have delivered networks before. Try and get to the bottom of what did work, what worked well. Speak to other local authorities or even private developers. We're encouraging the dialogue, and I think that's what today is about. This is trying to encourage dialogue and get the thought process in your heads of, okay, so these are all my options. Which one suits me? And that goes back to John's point about perhaps the workshop and asking yourselves as an authority some of those initial questions. The commercial model is key. And the commercial is key for everybody, because even if you outsource this to a partner to deliver, there's a commercial model, and any benefits you receive will be based on how well that commercial model performs. So to address issues around fuel poverty, I've been in a number of workshops recently looking at fuel poverty and how that can be addressed. And there'll be mechanisms within the contracts that you can put in place to ensure that the local authority gets something back to help reduce the issues that we've got currently on a massive scale around fuel poverty and the cost of heat. You as a local authority bring value to the table, whether you realise it or not. As much so at the moment, you bring a lot of value to the table, whether you do that yourselves, whether you're bringing, as Pete says, your own buildings, whether you're giving access to other housing stock, land, planning, etc., etc., etc. Don't underestimate that, and use that to your advantage to get your delivery plans of what you want delivered out into the market. And I think I'm probably just going to leave it at there about the lessons learned, and there's lots and lots of expertise in the market. And again, go back to use other people, use what they've got in their knowledge of what works well and what doesn't. Be realistic about how long this journey is going to take, but at the same time, be excited about the outcomes of what it can deliver, because this is everything that we've expected and wanted for the heat network market, because now coming forward, and this is a good opportunity to decarbonise at scale and deliver low carbon, low cost heat to both residents and commercial buildings. So I'm going to leave it there. If anybody obviously wants any further discussion, by all means get in touch. There's John's contact details in there, and myself and Pete and Tharina are obviously all happy to take discussion and points. We're going to open it up. We've got 10 minutes, so if I don't know, Tharina, if there's any questions in the chat, but we would like to obviously open it up where possible. If we don't get around to answering everybody's questions, if there's a few, because I can't actually see, then we will try and group them together and put a response back out to everybody that's attended today. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, John, for delivering an informative webinar. I think there's a lot of information that they've shared. I'm going to go through the chat to see if there are some of the key questions. If you just bear with me. I think this is quite an interesting topic, perhaps maybe Joe or John to address. We've had an attendee, Sheila, I do apologize, I hope I've pronounced the name correctly, that the requirement for connection won't apply to Scotland yet. So it's quite interesting to kind of from out, what do we see that the Westminster will influence kind of the policy development that side, and how the two can work together, the two policy elements.
Yeah, sure. I can pick that up. So the requirement to connect obviously isn't in force anywhere yet, but this is it's just a part of the consultations that has been put out at the moment. The requirement to connect is there to give demand assurance to investors. That's been a sort of a request from market, if you like. And in order to get investment into zones, areas, networks, cities, whichever terminology you use, there needs to be some sort of demand assurance, because these investments are in the hundreds of millions of pounds mark. And if we're expecting particularly external companies, so not even using local authority investment, we are going to need some demand assurance that says you will definitely get these anchor customers. Now, those anchor customers are yet to be defined. So the requirement to connect currently covers all new build development, and that's also caught up in the future home standards as well. So that's great. New build's fine. But there's still a definition required around what that means for existing buildings. And not only that, as well, when will they have to connect? If they do need to be required to connect, will it be within 5 years if they've got a new boiler, or is there going to be date set? So it doesn't currently exist anywhere yet, but there is a requirement to have some sort of demand assurance put into the heat networks zoning policy to give investors that opportunity to come to market.
Brilliant.
Yeah, the
Wonderful.
only point, sorry, the only point I'd add is I would encourage those north of the border to potentially to check out the zoning consultation documents that DESNZ have put out. I think they're extremely thorough, very detailed, very interesting in terms of roles for what they call a central authority, and zoning coordinator roles for local authorities. I can't really see how Scotland diverges too much from the sorts of issues that they're raising. So I think there's a lot that potentially applies up here as well, and will apply, because we need to meet the Ofgem regulations that are being introduced at a UK level. So I think there is a lot of crossover. From what I see, there is a lot of discussion going on behind the scenes between Scottish Government and DESNZ around these policy issues. So that's my gut feel, rather than, I don't have evidence for that, but that's what I imagine is happening.
Brilliant. I noted a question here from Hamish, which actually aligns to some of the QA discussion points that we have put on the slide. The question is, one of the key challenges is that some private operators want to cherry pick high value loads, stating they are not interested in social housing or domestic in need of retrofit. So I'm not sure, maybe Joe or Pete would like to address that question.
I'll take that if you want. So I think that's really the point that we are sort of discussing in there, around the value that you hold. So the commercial models of zones or areas or clusters, because as within a zone could be huge. You might have small networks if you're a little bit more suburban. So the point that we're making here around the models is holding the model will say, okay, this particular zone is fantastic and it delivers great returns, and that's going to be very, very attractive in the market. You might have another area that doesn't quite make those same commercial returns, or maybe not at all. Maybe it's really, really low. And you might say, well, actually, rather than somebody coming in and just taking all of the high return areas, maybe as an authority, I might want to put two together. I might want to put a high performing zone and say, okay, you have this one, you can deliver this, but in order to do that, you must deliver this, or you must address social housing, or you must address particular needs. And I think this comes back to the point we're making about knowing the value of what you hold, because there's a lot of value points in there, and there's lots of and to stop the cherry picking, you need to spread some of that risk out, because if you're developing a network, the tendency is always going to be to the big heat users, the condensed areas, the easy wins. But also, we know that there's a lot of good players in this market that are also addressing social value, social housing, and also some of the fuel poverty work. So just make sure that when you go to market, you're getting exactly what you need, as opposed to being pushed down a path of, well, we'll do that first and we'll address that in 20 years when we've got some return. That's not going to help achieve your target. So you need to make it as part of that initial procurement and initial conversations you're having with the energy partners. And there's some good examples in the market where that has been already done.
I think just building on that as well, Jay, in terms of when you're looking at how much control you want within whatever commercial structure you want to take forward, that can be a particular influence. So if you want to have the control around how that's actually delivered, that might point you more towards a JV model or a local authority model, as opposed to a free market model. But as Joe said, even if you go to free market, you have the opportunity to shape what that looks like, and don't underestimate your power as a local authority to do that.
Tharina, I've just one final point from me. The DESNZ zoning consultation that I just mentioned talks about the idea of local authorities pulling together multi-zone prospectus packs that contain a wide range of technical and commercial information about multiple zones. So for those organizations, and I've discussed this with a number of perhaps slightly non-city authorities, where they feel perhaps the best idea may be to group together their zones into portfolios and offer them as a as a pack effectively. But that comes with it all the things that Pete and Joe just talked about, which is putting together information on value, and that's one of the sort of missing points that I raised in my slides.
Perfect. So I see there's a question here that got a few thumbs up. So we're going to go to the question raised by Lewis, which is, at risk of delaying progress, how in depth should local authorities go in independent feasibility works to quantify their value, given that this is likely to be redone where a commercial partner is brought in? So who would like to take that one on?
I can answer it, and it's probably sort of goes into exactly the same point we've just been speaking about. Is it depends on the roles they would like to take, but in order to be informed, you need some sort of model. So you need to know, even if it's a basic model, so it's not a full-on investable model that you're going to take to a funder, but it's a model that shows at least the bare minimum of what load, what assumptions, what capex, what returns, what makes a zone valuable. Because without that, it's very difficult to negotiate your delivery options and your contracts. But would you want to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on feasibility? Probably not. Do you have the time to do that? Probably not. But there is ways where you may be able to bring that time frame down by getting at least what we would class as a basic model, which is still carries enough knowledge, if you like, to inform a board of directors at a local authority or others.
And I just one comment from me. If you're looking for an example, then have a look at the Heat Vision 2030 website, because we did a model like this for Glasgow, albeit just the centre of Glasgow. And we put a model together. Now, some of the assumptions that we then validated afterwards, we would now want to change in that model and an update. but it was a high level model for a large area of a city. That's the sort of model that I would expect people to be putting together as part of this early stage sort of strategic feasibility techno-economic modeling exercise.
And just building on that slide that talked about it is also it needs some time to be allowed to engage with those key anchor customers. Again, it's about making sure we have a portfolio of buildings that are real. And understand the impacts on the model if we need to make changes. So if we need to add heat pumps to a supply to upgrade the heat, what is the impact on the model, and what are the commercial solutions that are available, such as what are the private wire options available within a particular area. So it's not just looking at the heat network in isolation, it's around what are the other opportunities to better that commercial model.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you for our presenters and our webinar deliverers. And we're conscious of time. It is 11. We really appreciate everyone attending. Thank you very much. We will follow up all the questions that were raised as part of sharing the slides and the webinar afterwards. I think we may have 30 seconds. So I would like to ask John, Joe, and Pete just one final thought. One sentence for something to leave the attendees with as we depart. Joe?
I'm going to go back to the point of knowing your value, knowing what you want to get out of this, and using that to assist any delivery partner with achieving the requirements for your particular area.
I won't repeat that. So I'll look at it from the other end of the lens, and that is ensure you know your contracts. So once you've got into that delivery and operation phase, know what's in there, know your risk, your reward, and your share of that.
I'd just like to leave people thinking that this is a great opportunity. The market has finally recognized the value of heat networks. There is a lot evolving. The landscape is shifting under our feet. It's not easy to keep up, but it's all looking really positive, hopefully, and I think it's a good positive message to end on, is where things are going. And thanks to all the efforts that Scottish Government are making to encourage this policy area to move forward at pace.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. All the best.
Thank you.